We're back online. Let me do one last quorum check just to make sure I didn't miss anybody. We're good to go. We've got 8.
All right. Just pick up where we left off, Sarah.
Will do. Housing Authority Board of Commissioners. They do have specific powers that are delegated directly to them. They do have specific responsibilities that are assigned to them via HUD and federal regulations, and that body oversees all Housing Authority programs and funding. We do have a crossover member between both. When council wanted to create the Housing Commission, my concern was that the Housing Commission and the Housing Authority Board would not necessarily be working in opposite directions, but be working on similar things. We would have crossover, and that it was important to have a member that is on both. This is the only exception within current city commissions where a person serves on more than one, and that is Commission Member Moses Milazzo at this point in time, who serves both on the Housing Commission and the Housing Authority Board of Commissioners. On each agenda for each body, you will see an update from that commissioner on what is happening within the other body. And that is in an effort to keep everybody as informed as possible. So that's who the Housing Authority Board is. They oversee the programs I'm about to talk about. I share them with you so that you know and have a greater understanding of all of the housing programs the city of Flagstaff offers or oversees. This would have been Caleb Alexander, and you would have been spared my continuous voice. But since we gave him a pass, you're stuck with me. So next slide, please, Adriana. All right, so on the rental housing side, rental programs and affordable housing programs are most focused on lower income households. For example, the low income housing tax credit program, or LIHTC, is limited to 60% of area median income and below. For our community, that's $46,440 for a 3-person household. College students are not typically eligible really for any rental housing program, and that's because we look at a household's gross income to determine eligibility. Many college students are dependents of their parents, and so that household income typically disqualifies them. So I say typically not eligible because we do know that there are college students that are not dependents of their parents, that they do have their own income and live independently, and in some cases, those households are eligible. Our largest local demand for rental housing in our community, and we're seeing grow nationwide as well, is for 1- and 2-bedroom units. This is partially due to what is being called the graying of housing, and that is the need increasing with the aging population. And that is where we see the impacts of the baby boom generation aging. People are living longer, and so they may not be as prepared for retirement or a medical inability to work as they thought they were, and are seeking affordable housing resources. Adriana, next slide, please. The Flagstaff Housing Authority owns and operates 265 units of traditional public housing. These units serve 80% of AMI and below, with 40% of new residents being admitted. They have to be 30% AMI or below, so extremely low to be admitted into the program. To start with, this program serves families, elderly, disabled. The funding comes from HUD. And an interesting fact about public housing is that it is a program that has been being looked at by Congress to be phased out for quite a while. There is something called the Faircloth Amendment. It was passed in 1999. This is very simplistically stated, but that no new public housing units can be built or obtained after that date. So this is another spot where a program, those of you on the commission have already heard about. Also, this is an element of the bond as well. And that is the Rental Assistance Demonstration Program, also known as RAD, worst acronym ever. And that would allow us to redevelop or recapitalize our public housing and shift it off of a public housing platform. This is a regulation-based shift to a similar program. It would still serve the same population. It would still have all the similar dynamics of public housing with some changes on the backside that are invisible to the residents. This is what we've been talking about for quite a while, about redeveloping our existing public housing sites. I have a breakdown of those sites in just a minute. And I know that there's been great interest on where we are with this, where we had issued an RFP to identify a private development partner. It was an RSOQ, a request for statement of qualifications, not a request for proposals. We issued that. We felt that we had selected the most qualified respondent. I see that there'll be a comment. I'll finish my sentence and we'll go there if that's all right with the chair. And we have been unable to come to an agreement with the most qualified respondents. And since then, conditions have changed. And we will be reissuing that RSOQ to identify a development partner. I will pause for a question or a comment.
I have a question. I've actually never heard of the Faircloth Amendment. So is it saying that you can't use federal funds for new public housing?
So yes, and that is the only source of funds for public housing. It is a very specific HUD program. And the voucher programs are much more economical. They provide a larger community benefit with the funds flowing into the community. Public housing is expensive. Congress has recognized it's expensive. The reason RAD exists at all is because the capital needs of existing public housing nationwide have been severely underfunded for multiple decades, and there are capital needs that greatly exceed the available capital funds. And so thus the RAD program came up. The RAD program was approved by Congress in order to address those backlog of capital needs and shift away from what has turned out to be over time an unsustainable and expensive platform to provide housing. We will still provide housing. No one who lives currently in public housing will lose their home. The transitions, when it doesn't include redevelopment, is seamless and almost invisible to folks. When it does include redevelopment, every resident of public housing has a right to return. And if they choose not to return to the redeveloped units, we are required to give them a voucher for our voucher programs. So the Faircloth is a weird thing, and I've asked, like I've poked and poked because I'm naively optimistic. And I'm like, well, I know that some groups got rid of some housing authorities got rid of some of their public housing. So could we have those units since it would still keep the national number under? And the answer is no. And I've asked all kinds of like pokey what if questions. No, we had we can never have more than 265 units in our community under the traditional public housing model.
Okay, yeah, thank you for that additional detail.
You're welcome. All right, next slide. Here's our 265 units. We have 127 units in Brandon Homes, which is over off of Lone Tree. That includes a small office, and a maintenance shop, as well as a Head Start and a Boys and Girls Club. Actually, I think the Head Start has moved out of the Cogdill Center. That is the Cogdill Center there. You'll see the age of these units, 1952 through 1960 for construction. Those units are expensive to maintain. We can't even always find plumbing fittings to fit the pipes that those units were built with. We have an amazing maintenance staff that addresses things like that. Seiler Homes is 100 units, built 1972. Again, it does have a head start. And the shack, we call it the shack. It's not an actual shack. It's the Seiler Homes Activity Center. This is our main office, and we also have a large maintenance shop at that site. And then we have scattered site units, 38 units, purchased and developed 1986 through 2002. I'm anticipating Tyler's question saying, I thought you said after 1999 you couldn't have any new units. Well, the construction on those units, while the construction itself hadn't started, all of the funding had been approved, and the plans were underway to complete the last few scattered site units there. So we have some of the last constructed public housing units in the nation in our community. We had to get an exception in order for those to be accepted as public housing units. Those are scattered all throughout town. There's some on Cherry Hill, Southside, Sunnyside, Greenlaw, north of the hospital. So those units are scattered throughout the community. Next slide, please. I made reference to our maintenance staff. That's because they're phenomenal and amazing. But because we own and operate these 265 units, we are essentially the landlord. So we clear clogged toilets, and we turn units over when one household moves in, so a new household what household moves out, so a new household can move in. We're responsible for all of the grounds and systems. We actually own the gas systems under Seiler Homes and Brannon Homes. I won't cover it now, but if anybody's interested in the headaches that come with being our own small utility, I'd be happy to talk about it. That's something I'm hoping that we can resolve in a different way with redevelopment. We have a fabulous maintenance team. You guys are not going to get to hear about them because we don't talk too much about this side of the house to the Housing Commission. So when I get a chance to lay kudos on them, I do, because they really keep us running and are incredibly important. Next slide, please. We also operate Clark Homes. Many people think that Clark Homes is a public housing development. It's actually not. It's owned by the Flagstaff Housing Corporation, and the city of Flagstaff manages Clark Homes via a contract. It is a HUD multifamily project, which is the name of the HUD program under which it was funded, and the subsidy comes through. It serves 50% AMI and below, again, with a selection of residents must be very low income. It serves families, elderly, and disabled. It has an entire area of one bedroom units, single story, targeted at elderly. And again, this funding is from HUD. Next slide, please. Our next slide, let's talk about voucher programs. People mix up, and understandably, it's not something common that people know. What is Section 8? What is a housing choice voucher? How is it different from public housing? Public housing, we own and operate those units. Section 8, also known as the Housing Choice Voucher Program, is a voucher that is attached to a household. They don't live in housing owned and operated by the city of Flagstaff. They take that voucher out into the market and identify a unit in the market. I will talk, I believe, coming up about exactly how that works. These vouchers serve households at 50% of AMI and below, with a massive portion, 75%, at issuance must be to households at 30% and below. Serves families, elderly, and disabled, and we work with lots of local landlords. It is a tripartite relationship, and I have a triangle to explain that in two more slides. So next slide, please, Adriana. We have 529 plus of these vouchers. Did the slide switch? It hasn't switched for me yet. There it goes. We have 529. So we are allocated a certain number and type of vouchers that we must manage within a budget. And the money allocated to us per voucher is based on that fair market rent, which is, remember, it tracks 2 years. It's 2 years old. So this program is a challenge to administer, but we do it, and it is an awesome program. So why the plus sign? because we have some that are need-based. So we do have 333 plus 9 new. We were just granted 9 new vouchers. It's the first general purpose vouchers that have come out in a few decades. So we're working on figuring out the implementation of those. We have 106 VASH vouchers. This is in partnership with the Veterans Administration, and those vouchers are targeted to veterans who are experiencing homelessness or who have recently exited homelessness or working to exit homelessness. And those referrals only come to us through the Veterans Administration. We partner with the Guidance Center to administer 12 single-room occupancy units in 2 different complexes that are serving seriously mentally ill individuals. We have 40 mainstream vouchers. Wouldn't you think when it says mainstream that it would be in general? Nope. These are non-elderly households with a disabled member. That's the mainstream program. We were granted those 40 mainstream vouchers within the last 24 months. The same with the next 29 emergency housing vouchers, also referred to as EHV. Those vouchers came to us about a year ago and are targeted to households exiting homelessness, facing eviction, human trafficking, and victims of domestic violence. And then we have, this is the flexible number here, is the foster youth to independence. And these young adults come to us through referral from, it's not called Child Protective Services anymore, it's called Department of Child Safety. So these are the kiddos aging out of foster care. You're done at 18 and good luck to you. So this program provides we partner with them, they do the casework, we do the housing side to provide some housing stability for these young adults as they figure out what it's like to transition from foster care into living independently. This is a need-based piece, which is why I can't give you a number right now. We have 5, but we apply on an individual basis to HUD for use of this funding when Department of Child Safety refers a young adult to us. And then there's a new voucher program coming out called Housing Stabilization Vouchers. We have applied for those vouchers. I have a hope of getting some, but we won't know for a bit. So again, these serve extremely low and very low income households. And how do they do that? Next slide, please, Adriana. So the voucher is granted to the household, and the household goes out into the market to identify a rental unit. That voucher is attached to a household, not a unit. That household pays 30% of their annual income towards rent. The difference between what they pay in rent and the rental price of the unit is made up by a federal subsidy administered by us. So we execute agreements. The housing authority has an agreement with the participant who has the voucher and the landlord. The landlord has a lease with the tenant and an agreement with us, and these spell out the rights and responsibilities of each party. So for example, if you were a landlord and you are accepting housing choice vouchers, then you receive 2 payments every month, one from the household, which is reflective of 30% of their income, and the remaining balance from us as the housing authority. So that's how that program works. All those 529 plus units are rented in our community. That is money flowing to our local landlords. I promise you that I am almost done with you, and this is the actual mark where I am done with you, and I hand it over to Justina to give an overview of the other programs in the housing section. Thank you so much. I'll be back, don't worry.
Hi guys, it's Justina Costa, Assistant Housing Director. I'm gonna turn my camera off, but I did want to say hi. I will plan to zoom through my portion of the presentation. Thank you for your patience. This presentation is incredibly important, although it is lengthy. We did try to shorten it for you all, although it may not seem like it. So the first program that I will discuss is the Community Development Block Grant Program. Oftentimes, as Sarah said, you'll hear us refer to it as CDBG. Christine Pavlik is the primary lead on this program with assistance from our housing specialist, who is now Marissa Malloy. The CDBG program provides funding for both housing and community development activities. The funding is provided through HUD, and Flagstaff receives this funding because we are considered an entitlement community, which means that we do receive an annual allocation. Our allocation every year is based on a formula that HUD keeps nice and secret, as Sarah was joking around about the AMI. That formula takes into consideration a city's population, the age of the housing stock, and other community information. Our average annual allocation is approximately $600,000. Our highest allocation a long time ago was about $740,000. So it fluctuates, but we can safely say that annually we can approximate about $600,000. It's important to note that we don't have any control or influence over HUD's allocation to us annually. And what happens every year when we do get this grant is we do a competitive grant cycle to award this funding into the community. So you'll see that actually come before you sometime in December, January. You'll see that come out. Next slide, please. Next, we have affordable housing planning. Under this category, we have Jennifer Michelson, who is our housing analyst, and then Adriana Fisher, who's our housing program manager. Here we have the administration of the incentive policy for affordable housing. We negotiate with developers to include affordable housing in their developments. We do data and research. We do planning and analysis. And most newly, we are implementing the 10-year housing plan, which Sarah will discuss further in a little bit. Next slide, please. Another facet of what we do is we administer a permanent affordability program. There are two ways that we ensure permanent affordability, and that is through deed restrictions or the Community Land Trust program. In a deed restriction, sorry, Kira. In a deed restriction situation, the household owns both the home and the land under which the home sits. The deed restriction then limits who the home can be sold to, meaning it has to be sold to someone who has low to moderate income. And it also limits the future sales prices of that home. In a land trust situation, the household owns only the home and leases the land from the city of Flagstaff, utilizing a ground lease. When the household goes to sell the home, a resale formula governs how much that home can sell for, keeping it affordable for future buyers. Next slide, please. So the goal of the permanent affordability program, we have three goals. They are to provide opportunities for Flagstaff residents to ensure that housing is decent, safe, and affordable, to preserve quality and affordable workforce housing for future residents of our community, basically so that our kids can afford to live here as adults, and to preserve and encourage economic diversity in Flagstaff. Next slide, please. Ownership programs are often focused on first-time homebuyers, but not always. It depends on the funding source. And as Sarah previously mentioned, in ownership housing, you have both demand and supply tools, but demand tools are typically much cheaper. As you also know, federally funded programs are limited to 80% of the AMI and below. And so that equals about an annual gross income for a household of three. It's about $61,850. And of course, we have local challenges specific to Flagstaff here, such as high cost of living, limited land supply, etc. Next slide, please. Other program elements in the housing section include such things as employer-assisted housing. We provide technical assistance in the community. We manage our loan portfolio. We serve as a fair housing resource and referral agency for the entire community. We're very active in the community. We participate in the continuum of care, in the front door effort. We sit on the Coconino County Community Action Board, as well as serve in advisory roles on a few other nonprofit boards in town. And lastly, we're members and we actively participate in many state and national organizations. We're really, really proud of the work that we do, and it'll be really exciting to share that with you all in the coming year. Okay, back to Sarah.
In the interest of time, we're going to skip Tax Credit 101. I promise you, we will educate you at another time on this one, but we're going to move straight to what about other funding sources? And we'll come back to LIHTC at a different time. I'm going to cover other funding sources quickly. Are we there? It is. So we've talked about federal dollars, grant and entitlement dollars, and especially in relation to our weird size, our tween challenge. Justina mentioned CDBG. This is where CDBG comes in. We're not eligible for other programs you may hear about, USDA, Home, ESG, HOPWA, or Housing Trust Fund. We don't hit those thresholds. For state funding, we compete with the rest of Arizona for all the federal pass-through programs. We do have limited state-based funding. Again, we compete for. And then the tax credit program, that's development driven and a very complex financing model that we'll cover at another meeting. Local money, we do utilize some general fund dollars. Those are very limited. And when the economy crashes, say in 2008, we lost programs because there just wasn't funding for them. We actually lost programs and staff. Local money, not necessarily for us, but for other housing advocates in the community, private non and not-for-profit entities. And then there are foundation and nonprofit grants or financing. And something that is not unique to Flagstaff in any way, shape, or form is the involvement of employers in housing programs at various different levels. So you'll hear us say EAH. EAH is Employer Assisted Housing. Next slide, please. It all does track back to money, unfortunately. Next slide has to do with the Housing Emergency Declaration. So I mentioned before, City Council created the Housing Commission in 2019. First meeting was at the beginning of November 2019. Commission worked very diligently to create recommendations for potential bond measure in 2020, and then there was the pandemic. So the next big thing that came forward from City Council was the declaration of a housing emergency, and that happened in 2020 in response to a citizen's petition. This is really specific to municipal actions as well, but an acknowledgement of the housing situation we're facing in the community. So that housing emergency declaration, we work to encourage more economically priced housing, increase attainable housing opportunities for and occupied by, in bold, local residents. This is for the people that live within our community. Explore and support additional funding resources, and a foundational framework for establishing work programs, prioritizing staff work, and allocating necessary funding for implementation of these things. And that has to do with city management and budget. Next slide, please. The other piece of the Housing Emergency Declaration was that within 9 months, a housing plan focused on housing development and preservation within the city for the next 10 years will be presented to council. Aha! This was to be a single comprehensive community-facing document that looked at both our immediate and long-term goals and needs. And that plan was presented, draft plan, in 9 months. That was a huge lift, especially during pandemic when all the meetings were conducted remotely. So presented in draft form in 9 months, approved in February. I think that's our next slide. That 10-year housing plan was approved by City Council in February of this year. You'll note on the right-hand side, is the cover of the 10-year plan. It says underneath housing plan, create, connect, preserve, and protect. And those are the 4 main areas our strategies and policy initiatives are contained in. Next slide. Now we get to the fun parts, implementation of that plan. Where are we? Well, develop an evaluation process for the annual report and measurement of progress, create a first-year implementation plan, and successes and challenges. This says successes and challenges because we had a staff person leave us. We're over the point of saying, how dare she? We get it. But that is now Adriana is the employee to fill the housing project manager job, who will be overseeing the implementation of the 10-year plan. And her replacement is Marissa, who started with us last Monday. So Adriana is just now getting her feet underneath her as we move into implementation. You will be seeing an implementation plan. I'll talk a bit about that. However, next slide, please. We have not stopped. We did not just sit back and twiddle our thumbs because we didn't have a staff person specifically assigned to this. So we have been working on, which we have for a while, our incentive policy, which I will talk about, I believe, on the next slide. Create a dedicated funding source. There's Create 3 within the plan for affordable housing in Flagstaff. Proposition 442 is on the ballot for consideration in less than 2 weeks. Amend Flagstaff zoning code to facilitate the development of housing of all types and explore regulatory efficiency and cost-saving practices. Next slide, please. There's some pretty big tasks in there and relating to incentives and the regulatory environment, specifically the zoning code. Housing staff doesn't own those things. We are not the code administrators. We are not the ones that work on those things. So our lovely planning director, Michelle McNulty, has compiled a working group of both housing and sustainability. Council dedicated money during the last budget process for a land availability and suitability analysis for us to be able to identify available land in our community, look at common constraints or barriers, and set policy direction then with that information in mind, including but not limited to code changes, growth boundaries, available land supply, etc. And then also code analysis, and this is all codes to be examined through a lens of both sustainability and housing, looking to remove barriers to achieving the goals of the carbon neutrality plan and the Flagstaff 10-year housing plan, identify how our existing codes create unintentional barriers to these goals, and then to suggest code revisions that will reduce barriers. This is a massive project. We don't keep that many staff around in order to be able to embark on this on our own. Additionally, we feel it's very important to have a third-party analysis of these items so that we're able to see it through fresh eyes. So that RFP has been written. It's currently being reviewed by purchasing, and we anticipate that we will, knock on wood, have a firm identified within the next 6 to 9 months to be seeing this process moving forward in earnest. In the not too distant future, next slide, please. Also underway, Proposition 442 on the ballot. You've seen the video, hopefully you've seen the materials. There are 4 purposes in there. We'll see. I think we're 12 days away, which is a $20 million potential bond for our community to create rental and homeownership opportunities for the residents of Flagstaff. So what's next? I hate to tell you this, but it depends. So this is why you haven't seen an implementation plan besides us losing and replacing staff, is that 442 is on the ballot. And so we'll bring an implementation plan forward. However, if it is approved, it will look very different than if 442 is not approved. And I think that I hope it makes logical sense to you about why that is. If we have voter approved funds to work on some of these larger goals set forth in the plan, then those will be the initial things that you see up front and center within the implementation plan, in addition to the code analysis I mentioned previously. If it's not, We've already discussed where we focus our energies and the short-term goals identified within the 10-year housing plan. There it is. I knew I put it in here. 12 days to go. So next slide, please. That's the end of our information. I do realize we have some folks after us, but we're also open for questions. And I think I saw that Councilmember House had one.
Yeah, I was going to say, it looks like Kara House has public comments. So before the other commissioners ask any questions, Kara, you can unmute yourself and give public comment.
I don't know that it's public comment as your council liaison. So if other folks have other questions, please feel free to cut me off. But I just had two really. First, Sarah, is there any anticipated impact of Flagstaff's upcoming minimum wage increase to our AMA determination, voucher allowances, or CDBG funding?
That's a really hard question. Excuse me, I didn't go through the chair. Councilmember House. That's a really hard question. We have been watching our area median income levels to see impact of the changing minimum wage, and because AMI is based on our metropolitan statistical area, which takes in all of Coconino County, we are impacted by the vast rural areas surrounding us and have not seen a big change on those AMI adjustments. We do see that the AMI has continued to go up, knock on wood, it hasn't always gone up, but that the AMI we have seen continue to increase, which means more households are typically eligible when that number increases. And the second part of your question had to do with voucher allocation. No, I think that as far as the number of vouchers that we get, it's usually need-based, based on various numbers coming from various federal databases regarding our need, like our PIT count, that type of thing, go into those. The 9 new vouchers that we got were a complete surprise to us. We didn't know. HUD came out with this. We're releasing X number of new vouchers as the first vouchers. I almost deleted the email because it was so innocuous looking and it actually looked like a solicitation. But I was just going through it and I'm like, oh, no, that says 9 new vouchers. So those came to us as a total shock. So I don't see a direct impact on our local minimum wage to allocation of vouchers.
Great, thank you. And then second question was, it was actually one that was asked of me in terms of our bond efforts and some federal funding that I believe what was shared was that with tribal communities, some funding that was specifically allocated for housing opportunities either went unused or had to be returned because no programs were developed. So the question was if we have opportunities to partner with tribal communities and their housing programs in the efforts that are coming out of Flagstaff.
Chair, Councilmember House, again, that's a complex thing. Typically, those dollars, our dollars, we're restricted to the city limits of Flagstaff. Typically, the tribal dollars are restricted to tribal areas. Usually, we don't have the ability to overlap. If Flagstaff received an allocation, it's difficult to partner. I'm trying to figure out how to explain this. One, the city of Flagstaff has never received dollars that we haven't used and gave them back. That was from some neighboring tribal communities. Some of their challenges are developing closer to Flagstaff as a justification process that they have to have. And the areas of HUD are different. There's 2 main areas. One is CPD, Community Planning and Development, and that's CDBG and all of Justina's programs. The other side is Public and Indian Housing and PIH. And while it looks like the same money, quite often the rules are different for tribal allocations. We have had those conversations over the years, And the answers that we have gotten have been that they really want those housing efforts focused up closer to the reservation lands. There's been some shift in that politically in the in recent years, but we have been unable to successfully carry on an ongoing conversation due to the high rate of staff turnover within the public housing agencies on tribal lands. But I'm always willing to give it a shot again.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome. Great questions.
All right. Do any of the other commissioners have comments or questions? If not, I do actually have a few technical questions, but I want to be conscientious of the time remaining for the other presentations. Sarah, I'm assuming it's okay if I email you some of the smaller questions I have for you to follow up afterwards?
Sure, absolutely. I'm happy to delegate those out to other staff to be answered. No, I'll do it myself. Yeah, feel free to email away.
Okay, thank you. And then, giving everyone a chance to interrupt me if they do have a comment or a question. But if we don't, then I'll move us on to agenda item 6B, a presentation on the 2022 revisions to the carbon neutrality plan by Jenny Naiman, the climate program manager. And Jenny, if you're online, feel free to take over.
Thanks so much, Chair Denham. Folks, I really appreciate the time. I will try to be brief because this is in many ways just a preview of content that you will hear from me in August. And I believe Ramon Alatorre is going to pull up slides for me. I am presenting from my phone due to some internet challenges. Thank you so much, Ramon. I am going to talk about our process of carbon neutrality revisions. Again, we wanted to squeeze in here on this meeting just to give you a preview because this is an in-person process and we wanted to just have a quick chance to talk to y'all. Next slide, please. We are going through revisions on the carbon neutrality plan, and I'm going to talk really quickly about 3 types of revisions, and then most specifically about incorporating in the housing plan. Next slide. I'll refer to the carbon neutrality plan as the CMP throughout this presentation, and the CMP was adopted in June 2021. I will provide a timeline in the next slide. And I just want to say here, we've been getting a lot of questions of, didn't you all just adopt this? And we did, like the housing plan, the carbon neutrality plan, or the CMP is quite new. But because we have a very short timeline, we are committing to revising it every single year. Because we are just setting up that implementation framework, we are really keeping our revisions administrative and limited this year. Next slide, please. And Ramon, there is some funny animation here, but you'll get it right. Perfect. This is a really quick timeline for background that speaks a little bit to why we even have 2 climate plans and how they fit in with the housing plan. We developed our first climate plan, the first community-wide climate plan in Arizona in 2017 and 2018. The month before we went to adopt that, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC, came out with a deeply important report that kind of raised alarm and said everyone needs to move more quickly. All governments need to move more quickly internationally. We went ahead and adopted the CAP just to get our climate goals established, and we said we need to have a conversation with the community about how we need to move more quickly. And after that adoption, the community actually came back to us quite quickly and said, we do need to move faster. In January 2020, hundreds of community members came and said, you need to move more quickly. We need a climate emergency declaration. And so that led to the carbon neutrality plan, which is our current climate plan and the one that we are revising. I will talk a little bit about this later, but essentially that plan really only focused on rapid decarbonization or rapid reductions to our emissions. While we were developing the carbon neutrality plan, the housing emergency was declared. And then that housing plan, as Sarah just discussed, was adopted about 8 months after our plan was adopted. And so now we are in this revision process. Next slide, please, Ramon. So we are making 3 types of revisions to the plan. As I said before, they are all administrative in nature. The first is that we have some new information that's deeply important to the success of our goals. And so we've gotten new data on investment costs of the carbon neutrality plan. Our regional partners have moved forward with significant climate commitments that we are supporting and really excited and will really have an impact on how we achieve our goals. And then what we're here today to discuss is the city's adopted 10-year housing plan. Next slide, please. Standard and annual emissions will be, or revisions will be the next. We do these every year. Our greenhouse gas inventory is really about our emissions. It's our accountability mechanism to measure how Flagstaff is contributing to climate change. And then next slide. Finally, we will consolidate 2 of the City of Flagstaff's climate plans, or D2. And this will incorporate the resilient strategies and actions from our first climate plan and bring that into the carbon neutrality plan. This is a large change that I'll talk more about next month. Next slide, please. So the topic I'm here to really just preview for you today is that we're going to incorporate the core goals and policy initiatives of the 10-year housing plan into the revised carbon neutrality plan. We are deeply excited to do this, and it's because of the deep connections between climate and housing. The relationship is really strong in both our challenges as well as the solutions, and we prefer to talk more about the solutions. But housing relates so closely to all 3 of our core climate goals. So first is equity. Climate change will deeply impact housing. It will deeply impact folks' ability to live here as more people come to Flagstaff to escape the heat. Mitigation, because changes to our transportation, our land use, and our buildings can deliver deep emission reductions while saving money and helping people live more comfortably. And then through resilience, since the housing and crisis and the climate crisis both impact the strength of our neighborhoods and folks' ability to thrive. Next slide, please. And so due to all of those interconnections, we are incorporating core pieces of the 10-year housing plan into the carbon neutrality plan. We are just thrilled about this because of those connections. And so these revisions will actually create a target area based on housing. Target areas are basically like our chapters. We have 9 currently in the carbon neutrality plan. And so housing will be our 10th. I want to note it's really important. We will not be writing new housing policy here. That is not our job. That's yours. And so we will basically be doing a copy and paste, right? This will be a mirror image of the housing plan, but really incorporate those goals as well as the 4 policy initiatives of create, connect, preserve, and protect. Next slide, please. This is just a visualization of what the housing target area will look like. It will be a very significant part of the plan as its own target area, and will be a very important part of our strong neighborhoods focus. So that is all I have. I know time is tight, and Ramon is after me, but this is mostly just I will be back in November, and we'll be able to have a longer conversation about what exactly that will look like. But mostly we just wanted to kind of give y'all the heads up, and also that, again, this is not their creation of new housing policy. It is just a mirror image of the deep work that this commission did to create the housing plan. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you for that presentation, Jenny. And just to mirror what she said, this is an informational item only. It's going to return for discussion and feedback at the November meeting. But if anyone has any sort of questions or clarifications they want on the content, feel free to ask them now. I'll give a moment if anyone has one. All right. Well, again, thank you. Thank you, Jenny. I am excited to see you in the future for more discussion on this. Speaking for myself, I do see a lot of overlapping goals, particularly around land use, enabling more compact forms of land use. So yeah, until then, thank you. All right. Moving on to agenda item 6C, we have a discussion about rescheduling the November and December Housing Commission meetings around the holidays. And Adriana, I believe you have some options to walk us through.
I want to let everybody know that unless you want to spend Thanksgiving with us, which, I mean, we can make that a thing. Our November meeting falls on Thanksgiving, and then our December meeting is actually going to fall on the week of Christmas. So again, we can make that a thing if you really want to, but I was just gonna send out a doodle poll and see if we can do a combo meeting. And yeah, pretty much that's it for me. So yes, please just keep your emails ready for that email in that doodle poll so that we can decide a meeting date for a combination meeting.
Okay, and I'll just throw my voice out there and say that I am supportive of that. You are all lovely people, but I would like to spend Thanksgiving and Christmas with my family. Any other discussion, questions, commentary from the other council members before we move on to the discussion items? All right, in that case, we have a presentation by Ramon Alatorre, a climate analyst with the Flagstaff Sustainability Office, giving an overview of proposed revisions to the Sustainable Building Resolution.
Great. Can I confirm that everyone is seeing the slide deck?
Yes, and able to hear you as well.
Fabulous. Thank you so much. Well, thank you, Commission, for having me. Again, my name is Ramon Alatorre, climate analyst, here to discuss the Sustainable Building Resolution update. Here you will see my agenda. This is actually the same slide deck that was used to provide an update to Council on October 18th. So you'll see some similar things here. Council has given some discussion and input. We're also intending to return to Council and would bring forward any notes that you all have provided for that discussion as well. But the Sustainable Building Resolution is a policy document that has been outlining the performance standards that the city will adhere to as an organization when commissioning the construction of new buildings, as well as undertaking major renovations of existing occupied buildings. The Sustainable Building Resolution has always set an organizational standard that is beyond code, and it has also always explicitly recognized the council values of municipal leadership. Do like to give just a little bit of history. It was first adopted in 2008. That version was somewhat narrow. It only recognized LEED. In 2014, it was updated for the first time. It was a bit more flexible and recognized additional certification pathways. And now it has been about 8 years since it was last revised. Just a little bit of the language to highlight some of those previously mentioned motivations of leadership. The enactment quotes here also highlight the certification pathways of LEED green globes in the Living Building Challenge, as well as a non-certification pathway using ASHRAE to demonstrate equivalent performance. This option was included in 2014 in an acknowledgement that the costs associated with getting certified can be a major barrier to projects. So some of the motivations for pursuing updates in 2022 are listed here. They're mostly about policies that have been updated or that have been adopted by council. They're listed here just in the order that they were adopted by council. They are the Climate Emergency Declaration, Housing Emergency Declaration, the Carbon Neutrality Plan, 10-year Housing Plan, as well as the Sustainable Building Incentive. I will take a moment to highlight some of the language in each of these to draw some connections. The Climate Emergency Declaration clearly states a commitment to its own citywide transition, while the Housing Crisis Declaration directs staff to explore ways that the city resources can be utilized to prioritize housing efforts. And indeed, the Housing Crisis Declaration is the underpinning motivation for some of the major additions proposed in this cycle of updates. While the Sustainable Building Resolution hasn't historically included language that specifically intends to support increasing the number of available and affordable housing units, it has always provided language and guidance on how the city would manage the buildings within its portfolio during critical touch points. And so those have been the construction and major renovation. Section 5 of the proposed updates now incorporates a final critical touch point in a building or property's life cycle, and that is vacating the site. And it recognizes the opportunity to prioritize housing efforts during this event. Indeed, local governments often own buildings and properties that are located in desirable locations with access to employment, community amenities, walkable neighborhoods, and transit options, among other things. Therefore, in the event that the city chooses to vacate a building or property, repurposing these spaces for residential uses can be an equity-focused solution to increasing the supply of affordable and attainable housing. The connections to the carbon neutrality plan are plentiful. I'm actually going to move through some of these slides quickly to focus more on the housing related connections. Looking here at the 10-year housing plan, it specifically cites the need to increase the number of available and affordable housing options for Flagstaff residents at all income levels. And so with the long stated value of leadership in mind, if we're asking our developers and builders to build in this way, there was also a sense that we as an organization should start building in this way. And by this way, I mean in net zero and all electric when possible. So now that I've spoken to some of the policies and documents, I'd like to take a moment to pause and thank the people that have contributed to this effort. That team was made up of a band or steering committee that included staff from community development, facilities, housing, thank you, Christine, real estate, and sustainability. The band started organizing in August. We had multiple in-person meetings as well as multiple rounds of asynchronous document development. The Sustainability Commission has reviewed and provided input. We're now here to collect input from the Housing Commission. As I mentioned, it has been seen by Council once already, and we will be returning next week and would be pleased to bring forward any comments and feedback that the Housing Commission brings forward. So this slide summarizes the 3 main goals that are proposed in the revisions and updates. The first goal is to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions from city buildings. This would be accomplished by the trifecta of energy efficiency, clean electricity, and appropriate building electrification. The updated sustainable building resolution maintains the same minimum certification and/or performance pathways. So these would be LEED, Green Globes, and ASHRAE as being the sort of starting point in terms of the metric for providing guidance on the envelope, insulation, materials, and things like that. In addition, in most cases, it is expected that an all-electric design will be a viable approach. It is acknowledged that depending on the building and type or function, there may be some highly intensive processes that are not compatible with all-electric operation. However, low-grade space heating is not expected to be one of these. Finally, the Sustainable Building Resolution defines and calls for emissions neutral operations and notes that all electric designs will adhere to this standard so long as the city continues to participate in the Green Power Partners with APS. These updates are captured in sections 1, 2, and 3 of the Be It Resolved portion of the redlined Sustainable Building Resolution that was included in the packet. The second goal is to increase community resilience by ensuring that new buildings include amenities to support vulnerable residents during disruptive weather or other extreme events. Buildings with these supporting amenities are described as resilience hubs or as having resilience hub functionality. Some illustrative examples of what might constitute resilience hub functionality includes designing city buildings with features that allow them to serve as clean air centers during smoke events, cooling centers during heat events, warming centers during cold events, and refrigeration and backup power centers during power events. It was noted by both the steering committee and the Sustainability Commission that many existing municipal buildings could be great candidates for resilience hubs. However, they are not covered by the Sustainable Building Resolution due to the focus on these major life cycle touch points of new construction, major renovation, and vacating the site. This does not mean that the city shouldn't consider making these types of investments in community resilience outside of these lifestyle touch points. Indeed, the Sustainability Office has been including these types of investments for municipal buildings in budget requests for years and will continue to do so. However, it was determined that keeping the scope of the Sustainable Building Resolution focused on these touch points was the appropriate course of action. These updates are captured in section 4 of the Be It Resolved section of the redlined Sustainable Building Resolution. And The final one, which is kind of most in your pocket, the third goal is to support increasing the number of available and affordable housing units in the city. Section 5 of the Be It Resolved describes a process that directs the housing section to evaluate buildings and properties being vacated by the city to determine the feasibility of repurposing or developing in a manner that supports this goal. The Sustainable Building Resolution lists a few specific strategies to consider, though this should not be considered exhaustive. And by prioritizing this process, the housing section, in coordination with real estate and other departments, will be able to consider any number of creative opportunities as well as unique restrictions that may arise with each building and property type. So with that, I will bring this to a conclusion. Again, our goal is to incorporate any feedback you may have. We are returning to council next week on November 1st, and we'll be happy to share any feedback that has been brought forward.
Thank you for the presentation, Ramon. I have some stuff to say, but I want to ask the other commissioners first, any comments or questions? Okay, I'll go ahead and kick off the discussion then. When the Sustainable Building Resolution came up before the Housing Commission before, there was a lot of discussion on it. And what I'm going to say now is my perspective only, but it's my attempt to sort of synthesize a lot of that earlier discussion. So the goals are laudable, but there was concern around the incentives for private housing development, that basically the carrot, the incentives offered were not going to be enough to compensate for the additional upfront costs on the buildings. And when I look at the red lines in this resolution, it looks like you've tried to address that actually. So you've removed that table on the percent of density bonus, which is sort of staggered from 10 to 25, and you've given it a flat 25% across the board. So like one question to you directly, Ramon, is like, is that an attempt to address those previous concerns? And my second question to the rest of the commissioners is, does that in fact address concerns you may have had about the incentives not being enough to compensate for the upfront cost?
Benny has a quick comment.
Yeah. Hi, Chair Denham. I'm sorry for interrupting. I did want to make one point of clarification. So the residential sustainable building incentive that we did discuss this spring, and we did have a lot of great conversation about, that is a wholly separate policy from the sustainable building resolution. So the sustainable building resolution is just on City of Flagstaff buildings and what we do with City of Flagstaff buildings, how we build our City of Flagstaff buildings, as well as it relates to housing, how we might turn over City of Flagstaff buildings. So they do deal with very different types of buildings that we see as at the City of Flagstaff. I apologize for the confusion.
Yeah, and I think I would perhaps just want to, it seemed like you were referring to the red line document. I believe this is the red line document that was provided. The purple lines in here are about some of the council comments as well. So some of the updates that you were referring to seem like they are perhaps in reference to the Sustainable Building Incentive, the SBI, whereas what I was presenting on today is about the SBR, or the Sustainable Building Resolution, which is a little bit different.
Okay, I apologize for muddling the waters. So then what we're discussing today is really only in reference to requirements on city buildings.
Exactly, yeah, at those sort of critical touch points. So when the city is thinking about building a new building. So for example, the recent courthouse that was built, that was built to the Green Globe standard. It was 3 Green Globes, and we are recommending that we keep that sort of baseline sort of efficiency recommendations in terms of like when the city is going to be commissioning a new building, we should be commissioning a building that is efficient, that is utilizing clean energy, that we should be leading by example and that what we're doing is going beyond code. The Sustainable Building Resolution does reference the Sustainable Building Incentive, and that was that piece to say if we're asking our developers to sort of build in this way, and that's that net zero all electric way, we as an organization should be looking to pursue a similar course of development for ourselves.
Okay, and I actually see that Rebecca has a question.
Yep. So this resolution notes encouraging the city to reuse buildings and repurpose buildings for housing. So are we indicating in this resolution that we would have the same requirement for LEED silver for repurposed buildings? If you could just clarify that.
So for that would be perhaps in that like major renovations space, and sometimes it's not appropriate to try to achieve certification standards and major renovations. Depends on how major the renovation is, right? But the repurposing in particular is thinking about that final stage of vacating and the opportunity to repurpose for the purposes of housing. It is not necessarily an expectation that during that stage of like vacating and repurposing, that the housing would be built to those standards necessarily.
So this resolution is twofold. One, we want to indicate that the city's building should be LEED silver, which is an expensive expectation. And the second is that we would convert existing city buildings into housing without the LEED silver certification or requirements for building. Is that correct?
That we would explore whether that would be appropriate at the time of vacating, yes.
And I just as a secondary thought, wasn't in 2019 when the bond was issued for the courthouse, wasn't the purpose of that bond to also repurpose the courthouse into high density housing or low income housing, and that didn't happen? And I asked that because I'm curious on this resolution and why historically we have not done that when making agreements to do that with city properties.
I actually am not aware of what you're referring to in 2019. You could be right. I just can't speak to it. And I think there is potentially a sense that by putting something into the into policy like this as a resolution, that perhaps there would be sort of something a little bit more binding, something to point to say that this is the expectation of how we at least go through a process to prioritize housing when leaving a building.
Yeah, and I hate to interrupt, and I see that Sarah Dar has a hand raised too, but I'm going to pass it to Adriana real quick because I think she has a discussion point related to the time. We're almost at the top of the hour and we need to check quorum.
Let's let Sarah go, Tyler, and then we can see if there's more conversation.
Okay, Sarah, go ahead.
I'll keep it short and sweet. There was not a link between the courthouse bond and any provision of housing by this city, to my knowledge, and I've been here for 22 years at this point. So no, I'm not quite sure where that information came from. And if you want to follow up outside of the commission meeting, we can talk in more detail. Thanks so much.
Any more comments to email them your way?
That would be fine.
Perfect. And then we have, okay, so the next three items, Chair, we don't have anything newsworthy to keep you from adjourning the meeting except for one tiny 30-second thing from Christine Pavlik. And Ramon, did we cover everything? I'm so sorry that we cut it so close.
No, I believe it was covered, and if any commissioners do have comments that I would be able to share with council next Tuesday, I'd be happy to receive those today and tomorrow.
Fantastic. So if anybody has any comments, feel free to email them to me just because you have that handy. And I'm happy to forward those to Ramon, or I'm happy to send Ramon's contact information. Christine?
wanted to let everyone know that we will be releasing our notice of funding availability and application to the community for the American Rescue Plan Act local recovery funds for housing assistance the second week of November. For those of you that are new, council allocated $1.9 million to housing assistance in ARPA funds. And so this is our process for having the community respond with applications and requests for funds. And we will go through a whole review process and then allocate those funds out early next year. So yeah, if you have any more questions, otherwise we will give you an update once we get a little further in that process.
Yeah, thank you so much for that update, Christine. And yes, we are a minute past, so I'll give a quick moment if any commissioners or housing staff want to give an update. I'll count down from like 10 in my head. And if not, in order to respect everyone's time, thank you all so much for joining this meeting. Really appreciate it. We will adjourn at 3:01 p.m. Everyone, have a great day.
Thank you.
And Sue, have a good weekend.